I'm Doug Farrer, and this is The World Unpacked. On August 31st, the last U.S. military flight left the Kabul airport. This marked the end of America's longest war, nearly 20 years after the attacks of September 11th, 2001. The pullout from Afghanistan has sparked a fresh debate over America's role in the world and how U.S. power can and should be used. Joining me today is Stephen Wertheim, a senior fellow in Carnegie's American Statecraft program. We'll unpack the legacy of the Afghanistan war on America's foreign policy and how U.S. foreign policy can adapt to meet new challenges. Here we go. Stephen, welcome to the show.
It's nice to be with you.
So before we get into the topic, tell us a little bit about yourself.
I am a historian of U.S. foreign policy, and I am currently working at the Carnegie Endowment, which you know about, in the new American Statecraft program, trying to build a more disciplined and realistic U.S. foreign policy.
We wish you all the luck in that, and it's great to be your colleague. So before we dive into the full topic, obviously the anniversary of 9/11, tragic day in our history, is on Saturday. It's been 20 years, and there'll be a lot of reflections by many different people on what that day meant to them and where our foreign policy has gone since then. You have a lot to say on that, and I'm looking forward to hearing about it. But I think one thing that's kind of quintessentially American story is, where were you on an important day? So I want to know, where were you on 9/11?
I was attending high school outside of Washington, D.C., and a voice came over the intercom and told us to turn on our televisions. Something horrible was happening. And I remember being sent back that day on the bus early home and discussing with friends that the United States was likely to mount a substantial reaction to these attacks. We didn't know who did it, but that certainly proved to be correct.
I remember that day as well. I was in English class, and it was certainly formative for me as a young man. Let's talk about how the world has gone and the United States has gone in the 20 years since 9/11. And I think a good starting point is Afghanistan. We've all watched the terrible scenes of the withdrawal and the kind of desperation of Afghans to get on planes at Kabul airport and flee the country. It's been a horrific few weeks for Afghanistan, but now the U.S. is officially out. And you've been very supportive in your writing and on social media of Biden's decision to pull out of Afghanistan. So starting at the specific, why are you supporting Biden's withdrawal from Afghanistan?
Well, I think the end of America's participation in the war in Afghanistan has been long overdue. I think the United States chose to adopt a mission that was very unlikely to be achieved, that of building a new state in Afghanistan on a Western model and trying to defend that state by force as the Taliban insurgency grew. So very quickly after 9/11, I think the United States was correct to use force to go after al-Qaeda, the organization that attacked the United States, and to punish the Taliban government for harboring al-Qaeda. I think that was correct, but I think the mission was achieved to the extent it would ever be verifiably achieved very quickly. And from that time on, I'm afraid the United States was doing itself more harm than good by participating in that war. I think we can certainly talk about whether the withdrawal could have been planned for and executed better than it was. I think it wasn't the worst case scenario. It certainly wasn't the best case scenario. But the most important thing is that the U.S. War in Afghanistan, and it seems the war in Afghanistan itself, the civil war, have come to an end.
I don't think history is littered with examples of withdrawals from losing wars that are gracefully executed. But I think the point you raised about nation building, about sort of the transition between the mission of hunting down the folks who were responsible for 9/11, Osama bin Laden, and then the transition to kind of building a state in Afghanistan is an interesting point. And I guess I would ask you a simple question. Why is the United States so bad at nation building?
I'm not sure it's a particularly American problem. I think nation building by an outside power or even by the international community is an extraordinarily difficult thing. There just aren't a whole lot of success stories, period, because the idea of nation building is, in fact, that somebody else is attempting to build a nation for another group of people.
I want to zoom out a little bit more and ask how we got here. You recently wrote a New York Times piece where you labeled the Oval Office as the imperial presidency. And without putting words in your mouth, you're basically saying that in the post 9/11 era, the powers of the presidency have expanded quite a bit. So can you talk a little bit about what that means and how 9/11 played a big role in leading to this outcome?
Well, when we debate what went wrong in America's post 9/11 wars, including in Afghanistan, the debate tends to focus on which president or presidents got it wrong. But that itself is part of the problem because, in fact, it's Congress that the US Constitution gives the power to declare war, and only the Congress. And yet, the last time Congress issued a declaration of war was during World War II in 1942. And so since then, so this is a long, ongoing process, but since then, Congress has mostly issued less formal authorizations and deferred to the president when it comes to making decisions about war and peace. So all of the U.S. current military operations, the legal authority for that derives from a 20-year-old declaration, or I should say a non-declaration, an authorization passed very quickly in the immediate aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. So one of the reasons why the presidency has so much power, to my mind, it's not really the president's fault. It's that Congress prefers to abdicate its responsibility to decide whether the United States should go to war or whether it should remain at peace.
It seems like now might be a moment where you could see, following Trump, where he sort of put the imperial presidency, as you call it, in a spotlight. A lot of talk about, oh, he's got the nuclear codes, what a risk. Where you might see Congress and even President Biden move to constrain this imperial presidency a little bit. Let's say they go through with it, though. Wouldn't a limitation on the president's ability to initiate military interventions actually be a security problem for the United States? I mean, I'm thinking like natural disasters or extremely limited humanitarian missions.
Well, I think right now it is hard to look at the Congress that we have, and in light of the way Congress has acted, and say, yeah, these are the people that we want making rapid decisions about national security. But I think this condition has been allowed to exist because essentially all parts of our political system have accepted Congress ducking its responsibility. So I think on a systemic level, it would be better for if Congress won't grow a spine of its own for the president and for the rest of the country, the voting public, to hold Congress to account and actually make it take difficult votes.
You paint in your work, in your tweets, in your writings, and you're not.
Thanks for shouting out the tweets. I mean,
yes.
That's really the main meaning.
Please go follow Stephen on Twitter. His tweets are excellent. Okay, but you paint a pretty pessimistic image of U.S. global engagement, certainly over the last 20 years and potentially even longer. And I'm not really here to challenge you on that. The track record speaks for itself. But there have been instances, and certainly people who disagree with you would raise these, where U.S. diplomacy and military might has been used for quote unquote good. Can you tell me what instances you think the United States engaged globally in a way that did have a profoundly positive impact?
Well, I think there are many forms, just to take our recent period of non-military engagement that have been quite important. The U.S. initiative to combat AIDS in Africa, or the Ebola pandemic, one wishes we would have paid more attention to the threat of pandemic disease after that episode, which occurred under the Obama administration. I don't think that all uses of force are bad. I don't identify as some sort of non-interventionist or pacifist. I think the 1991 Gulf War was at least debatable, but I think it served a positive goal for the international community. I think leaving U.S. troops in the region afterwards was a mistake, but stopping Saddam Hussein's illegal invasion of Kuwait was a worthwhile goal. And I think some cases of humanitarian intervention also might meet my standard. And what I'm concerned about is that the U.S. role in the world has been running on inertia for quite some time. And a system of global military dominance that was initially conceived and constructed to deal with the threat of conquering totalitarian powers in the middle of the 20th century has outlived its original reason for being and actually has been counterproductive for the United States.
I think that's a fair assessment that we need to change. I guess flipping this question around, what are the conditions or circumstances or shape of a U.S. military intervention that you think makes sense? What would meet your threshold? And obviously understanding that circumstances change, but sort of some basic principles of how the U.S. should use its military.
Yeah, I think the main reason for military intervention, and this is not particularly on its face original to me or anything, is that it should be in a vital security interest of the United States. In other words, it should be necessary for the safety of the American people, or necessary to allow the United States to have a prosperous economy.
So the answer you've given is probably one you could hear from folks who agree with you or who seem to be on your side, maybe a Stephen Walt, that kind of person. But you might also hear a similar answer from a more hawkish person like Richard Haas. So what differentiates your view from those views?
I think the main difference is a structural one. So yes, I think pretty much everybody in the national security community, if they support a military intervention, thinks that military intervention will be good for American security. But I think the United States has actually created threats to itself, in a sense, by remaining so globally committed and deployed after the Soviet Union collapsed. And so we actually incentivize actors around the world to target U.S. troops when we scatter them so widely and get involved in disputes that otherwise might remain localized and not come back to the United States.
When we come back, I'll ask Stephen about how the United States should deal with its great power rivals and what the United States foreign policy community should think about in the next decade. Hey, thanks for listening to The World Unpacked. If you're enjoying the show, leave us a rating and be sure to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. So, Stephen, you've basically made the case that the U.S. should be very careful and rarely get involved in another country's affairs, especially from a military perspective. Some people listening to this show may even go so far as to say you have some isolationist tendencies. So is that true? And if it is true, is this a different spin on President Trump's America First ideology?
So the term isolationism is certainly not one that I would identify with. And I happen to have done some historical research on this topic. This is a term that has always been used essentially to tarnish critics of the use of force or U.S. global dominance. Actually, for most of American history, the term wasn't in circulation. It was only in the 1930s that some people who now thought the United States needed to enter World War II and become the globally dominant military power, they applied to their opponents, calling them isolationists, when actually many of their opponents wanted the United States to guard the entire Western Hemisphere by force and to trade and otherwise engage through international law and other means on a more global basis. So this is a term of abuse, and it's really just applied to the person who wants one fewer war or one less U.S. military commitment than is the case, than is the status quo. Now, as to the question about President Trump, that's a complicated one. I wrote throughout the Trump years essentially that Donald Trump was much more militaristic than he was, quote unquote, isolationistic. And I think the record of the Trump administration bears that out. Donald Trump didn't end a single war. He didn't start any new ones, I suppose, if that, that is a low bar, but he cleared it. So I think he had, at best, you can say, conflicting impulses. And I will say, yes, there was a kind of aspect of what Trump was presenting that I do think is healthy. That aspect would be that the United States doesn't need to guard some abstraction called international order by force. That the United States, when it embarks in military interventions, should not try to fundamentally transform other countries. I think those were important impulses, and I hope they are built upon by conservatives and others who liked his America First approach.
I think you make a compelling case about the nation building and about interventionist policy. But what about a kind of a lower level, right? I mean, the United States has been at times described as the world police. We keep free and fair access to waterways. We ensure that global trade can continue and grow and so forth through our military, through basically our forward deployed military. So do you want us to pull back from that? Is that part of global dominance that you think is a relic of the previous century? And if we do, aren't we just kind of ceding territory to an authoritarian state, maybe China, potentially Russia?
So I do think the United States should pull back with a number of its military positions and commitments. I do, however, agree with the objective that the United States does have an interest in having free global commons, in having waterways through which commerce can take place. I just think that that is not the reason why the United States is as committed globally as it is. And what is needed to ensure basically free commons is a much, much smaller military presence than the United States currently has. So I think where it's possible for the United States to pull back and allow other countries who have similar interests that we do in allowing trade to go forward, we ought to do that and not impose all of the risk and cost on the United States.
So we've talked a lot about how the United States needs to change, update its foreign policy, and limit, especially its military engagement. Let's flip it a little bit. What are the kind of efforts that the United States should be positively investing in as an international actor?
Absolutely. So I think the United States, again, this will sound very traditional, and then it will go in an untraditional direction. I think the United States ought to take a fresh assessment of what the threats are to the American people where they live and work. And to my mind, Doug, you and I are talking via Zoom, even though we are colleagues. So pandemic disease has to be near the top of that list. And so does climate change. In fact, I think I would put climate change at the very top. So these threats, which, again, people have been saying this for quite some time. We've known about climate change for many decades over the course of my adult lifetime. And yet, the vast majority of time, attention, and resources in the national security community has gone to maintaining global military dominance. And I do think that China is, if there is a nation state that challenges U.S. interests through its conventional military capabilities and through what those capabilities might become in the future, it is China. So it is appropriate to for the United States to take measures to make sure that worst case outcomes don't occur as China's rise continues, if indeed it does continue. At the same time, if we put climate change first, we have to recognize that China is the number one emitter of greenhouse gases, and the United States is number two. And I do not think that a Cold War-like situation, a long-term, intense strategic rivalry between the world's number one and number two powers in terms of their military capabilities, their economies, and their greenhouse gas emissions is going to be a conducive environment for us to actually make the changes globally that we need to make to the economy in order to get the global warming crisis under control.
You've laid out a vision for how the United States should and should not engage in the world. I guess I'd ask you, how is Biden doing so far?
Good question. I think Biden has surprised me a little bit in how determined he does seem to break with the inertia of the past and make changes that are corresponding with the way in which the United States and the world has actually evolved. So I guess you could say I'm giving him praise here. The decision to end the war in Afghanistan was, I think, a somewhat courageous one, the right one. And that said, there's so much further to go if Joe Biden wants to go in this direction. I am hopeful that his administration will take a rigorous look at the entire war on terror footprint. But then I think the administration has shown an impulse, a kind of all of the above impulse. It came out of the gate promising, good things essentially to everyone. America was back. Multilateralism was back. There would be new initiatives to address climate change. At the same time, we were entering an era of extreme competition with China, to quote the president. So I think we've seen on Afghanistan, Biden's outstanding foreign policy decision to date, that the president was able to put conflicting impulses aside and make a decisive choice to end that war. And I think a major question is whether he will do the same in relations toward China and Russia, or whether the kind of balls that are still up in the air will remain there over the course of 4 or 8 years.
You talked about how President Biden was resolute in his decision to leave Afghanistan, and he did so in the face of huge criticism from right-wing media like Fox News, which is going to criticize him for anything, but also from mainstream media outlets like the New York Times and the Washington Post. He also had withering criticism from foreign policy professionals, folks who are part of what Ben Rhodes famously called the blob, which is the permanent foreign policy decision-making class in Washington. Those folks tend to have hawkish views, and obviously withdrawing from Afghanistan flew in the face of a lot of what they think the United States should be doing in its global engagement. I don't want to have an argument about the blob necessarily, but what I do want to know is, what ideas do you have for how the United States can create a group of foreign policy professionals who can come up with more ideas and better policies for how the United States should engage with the world?
Well, I do think that there needs to be a wider debate in Washington. I think there's actually a pretty wide set of views in the country when you talk to ordinary Americans about what they think about foreign policy. And they would be They are very skeptical of what the United States has been doing and would be receptive to a range of different options. Perhaps that's one reason why Donald Trump was able to pass muster with enough voters to be elected in 2016, or indeed Barack Obama in 2008. And I do think that the foreign policy community in Washington is slowly starting to reflect the skepticism and the new ideas that are more prevalent in the rest of the country. You pointed out the controversy that the withdrawal from Afghanistan created, but polls suggest that a supermajority of the American public supports the withdrawal even after they've seen the chaos that attended that withdrawal. It's upwards of 70% of Americans. That's certainly not reflected in the foreign policy debate in Washington, at least as transmitted on cable news and op-ed pages. But, I think it is a real challenge to figure out how, not just to sort of catch up on issues like military intervention that have become politicized, but how to build a more dynamic and representative foreign policy class.
Stephen, thank you so much for joining us.
It was my pleasure.
Hey, thanks so much for listening. We want to hear from you, so email us at podcasts@ceip.org. And you can find me on Twitter at Douglas L. Farrar. That's Farrar. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button and leave us a review or a rating. The World Unpacked is produced by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Our audio engineer is Tim Martin, and our executive producers are Cliff Jayapranada and Clarissa Guerrero.